Madame Zhao nodded. Yes, she knew that the greatest difficulty for their small family was not that they were starving, but that winter was approaching and there were no winter coats in the house for winter. Without money, they couldn't buy cotton and cloth. How could they survive the cold winter? The only thing that they could sell to earn money were those wild chestnuts. Su Sanlang stroked Su Xiaolu's head again, then left the house. Soon they could hear him breaking through the bamboo. There was also the sound of Su Chong, Su Hua, and Su Sanmei playing together. Madame Zhao looked at Su Xiaolu gently and said softly, "Si Mei, our family will definitely survive, right?" Su Xiaolu looked at Madame Zhao and smiled at her. Of course it would get better and better. The baby's innocent smile was like the sweetest dew in the world and the warmest morning sun. It instantly made Madame Zhao's heart sweet and warm. Su Sanlang, who was outside the house, quickly broke through a lot of bamboo. He broke through the pieces again until they were thin bamboo strands. Then, he began to weave. Meanwhile, Su Sanmei was playing with rocks with her two brothers. It was raining outside, so they couldn't go out either. For 4 hours in the afternoon, Su Sanlang weaved bamboo baskets. When it was almost dark, the rain stopped. Seeing that it was not dark yet, Su Sanlang stood up and said to Su Sanmei, "I'm going out for a while. You stay at home and watch the house, okay?" Su Sanmei looked up at Su Sanlang and nodded obediently. "Yes, don't worry, father, I know." Su Sanlang then said to his two sons, "Hua, Chong, stay at home and don't wander around. You have to listen to your sister, understand?" Su Chong and Su Hua nodded. Then the two of them looked at Su Sanmei expectantly, signaling her to hurry up. They hadn't had enough playing with stones. Su Sanlang smiled and turned to leave. He wanted to take a look at those traps before nightfall. Perhaps he would find something. He held hope in his heart, but he knew that they would most likely be empty. Animals in the mountains were not easy to catch. They were all very clever. He had almost reached the first trap when Su Sanlang heard the sound of flapping wings. He paused at first. Then in ecstasy, he raced toward it. His movement startled a pheasant with black fur and a green tail in the trap. Its wings fluttered even more fiercely as it tried to fly, but it was trapped by the rope on its feet. Su Sanlang pounced on the pheasant and hugged it tightly. Very cautiously, he took down the rope and used it to tie up the pheasant's wings. "Thank God," Su Sanlang whispered happily. However, what Su Sanlang did not expect was yet to come. Inside the second trap was a turtle dove. The third was empty, but the insects had been eaten and the trap was destroyed. The fourth and fifth traps yielded a pheasant and a hare. The sixth and seventh traps were empty. The bait was eaten and the traps were destroyed. The eighth, ninth, and 10th traps yielded 2 hares and a turtle dove. When he returned after seeing all the traps, his hands were already full. Su Sanlang couldn't stop smiling. He felt like he was stepping on clouds. In the past, after the autumn harvest, old Master Su would bring a few of them into the mountains to set up a few traps. It would be considered good if they could catch 1 or 2 hares a year. This time, all of his traps worked and the animals were all alive. If he sold them, he could earn some money. Before he entered the house, Su Sanlang was already shouting happily, "Darling, darling, quickly get up and take a look." Su Sanmei, Su Chong, and Su Hua ran out when they heard the commotion. When they saw the pheasants and hares that Su Sanlang was carrying, they exclaimed, "Wow, there are so many of them, Daddy." Madame Zhao had already sat up. Before she could get out of bed, Su Sanlang had already carried the animals into the house and said happily, "Darling, look, I just went to check the traps. All of them worked. I caught 3 hares, 2 pheasants, and 2 turtle doves. They're all alive. I'll drown these 2 turtle doves and make soup for you later." Madame Zhao was pleasantly surprised. She quickly said, "No need, no need. Sell them for money." There were some chestnuts at home. Coupled with these wild animals, they could be exchanged for some money. With money, they could buy cotton and cloth. Thinking of this, Madame Zhao's worries dissipated a little. Su Sanlang knew that Madame Zhao was worried. He looked at her gently and said, "We can earn money in the future. The 2 turtle doves don't have much meat and aren't worth much. I'll make some soup to nourish your body and let Sanmei and the others have a sip too. I'll go to town tomorrow and see which family needs firewood. Darling, don't say anything, just listen to me. Let's eat some wild animals today." The bait for the trap was caught by Sanmei too. "We have to reward our daughter." Su Sanmei was standing beside Su Sanlang when he entered the house. Su Chong and Su Hua's eyes landed on the pheasant and hare from the moment they entered the house. They licked their lips and swallowed their saliva. Su Sanmei swallowed and looked up. "Father, I'm not eating, I'm not hungry." Su Sanlang's heart ached as he looked at his considerate daughter. How could a poor family not crave meat? Madame Zhao's eyes were also a little pained. She thought of the days before they were separated from the family. When they ate, even if there was meat, it would not be theirs to eat. In the eyes of Madame Wang, Su Sanmei was a good-for-nothing. She should have been drowned to death as soon as she was born. Her very existence annoyed Madame Wang. She was not even allowed to eat more rice, let alone meat. If Su Sanmei looked too hard at the meat, she would be scolded. Thinking of this, Madame Zhao's heart ached. Her eyes were slightly moist as she looked at Su Sanlang and said, "Sanlang, you're right. It's all thanks to Sanmei's diligence that we can eat turtle doves tonight." Su Sanlang ruffled Su Sanmei's hair and said, "Sanmei, go and start the fire. Hua, Chong, come with me and help me lock up the rabbits and pheasants." Su Chong and Su Hua clapped and followed Su Sanlang happily. Su Sanmei also went to the stove to boil water. After Su Sanlang and his 2 sons had settled the hares and pheasants, they drowned the 2 turtle doves in water. They were heated in hot water before they plucked their feathers. Su Sanmei was a diligent helper and had already cooked the rice. This is rare. Su Sanlang could not even bear to throw away the birds' intestines. He washed them all and cut them into large pieces to cook in a pot. Before long, the rich aroma of meat wafted into everyone's noses. Su Xiaolu smelled it too and was very happy. Insects with spiritual energy were loved by birds. This meant that there was a high chance that Su Sanlang's traps would work well in the future. If he caught something, he could exchange it for money. Once he exchanged it for money, their lives would be easier. When dinner was ready, Su Sanlang brought a bowl of meat soup to Madame Zhao. Madame Zhao could not bear to eat so much meat. She said, "I don't have to eat so much. Let the children eat." Then she called to Su Sanmei, "Sanmei, come here." There had to be an entire turtle dove in this bowl. Madame Zhao couldn't help but tear up. She had cried a lot. She cried when she was sad and also when she was happy. Su Sanmei replied from the outer room, "Mother, I have meat to eat. I'm not coming." Su Sanlang smiled and said, "Hurry up and eat. Our daughter is worried about you too. I'll go and fix the traps tomorrow. I'll catch more in the future. Every time I catch something, we'll eat a little." Madame Zhao looked at Su Sanlang and said softly, "Sanlang, you eat too." Madame Zhao picked up a piece of turtle dove meat and fed it to Su Sanlang. As he retreated, she said, "Sanlang, if you don't eat, then I won't eat either." Madame Zhao knew that Su Sanlang had given all the meat to her and the children. He probably couldn't even bear to take a sip of the soup. And how could she bear to see this? They were family. Seeing how determined Madame Zhao was, Su Sanlang had no choice but to eat that piece of meat. Turtle dove meat smelled really good. Even the bones were soft after a long stew. After dinner, the family washed up and went to bed. Su Sanlang got up early the next morning to cook and woke Su Sanmei up to help. When it was done, Su Sanmei went back to sleep. When Su Sanlang entered the house, Madame Zhao was awake. As if she knew that he was going out, she said gently, "Sanlang, I don't know much about trade either, but I heard from eldest sister-in-law and second sister-in-law in the past that you have to compare goods with other shops. Try going to a few more places." Winter was coming and the weather would get colder. Madame Zhao only hoped that they could sell for more money. Su Sanlang was also a little nervous, but he smiled and said to Madame Zhao, "Darling, don't worry, I know what to do. I'll go now, you stay at home. If there's anything, call for the children." "They're obedient." Madame Zhao nodded. Su Sanlang did not want Madame Zhao to worry too much, so he did not delay. He placed the animals at the bottom, placed more than 10 caddies of chestnuts on top, and carried them out. Madame Zhao watched Su Sanlang leave and sighed softly. She prayed silently in her heart that the heavens would bless their family. Su Xiaolu yawned and said to herself, "Sending good luck to Daddy." It was dawn when Su Sanlang left the village with the basket on his back and the villagers were still asleep. He looked back in the direction of his home, his eyes filled with many emotions. However, it was only a glance, and he moved on determinedly. The town closest to the village was called Goathorn, and Su Sanlang was prepared to go to Goathorn to sell the animals and the wild chestnuts. It was a 2 hours walk from the village to the town. Only when he reached the town did Su Sanlang learn that they had to pay a fee to enter. Those who didn't have money to pay had to make do with what they had, or on credit. There was a big river outside Goathorn, and there was only one way in and out of town. If he wanted to get away with it, he'd have to cross mountains. If one tried to cross the mountains, they could encounter poisonous insects and snakes. If they were bitten, they would even lose their lives. Therefore, the soldiers guarding the city were not worried about anyone escaping the toll. When it was Su Sanlang's turn, he mimicked the others and said, "Officer, I'm from the countryside to sell some wild goods from the mountains. I don't have any money now. Can I make up for it when I come out after I sell these?" The soldier guarding the city was a middle-aged man. He looked at Su Sanlang and asked calmly, "What are you selling?" Su Sanlang answered honestly, "Wild chestnuts and 2 pheasants." "Fine, just put your thumbprint here and go in." The soldier brought a piece of paper to Su Sanlang, who obediently pressed his thumbprint and carried his basket into the city. There were many streets in the town. Street vendors shouted at the commoners passing by, "Come and eat noodles and fragrant meat buns." Su Sanlang carried the basket on his back and looked around. He didn't approach anyone to ask questions. Instead, he decided to walk around first. After a while, he had a rough idea. Like him, there were many people who came from the countryside to sell things, and they were all gathered in a single street. Down the street, one could see many pheasants, hares, and wild fruits. Many well-dressed women walked past with baskets in their arms. When they saw something they liked, they would ask about the price. Su Sanlang observed the crowd. Most of the hunters' prices for pheasants and hares were 20 copper coins a catty. Everyone's prices were about the same, and Su Sanlang had an idea. He took out the chestnuts, pheasants and hares and prepared to wait for someone to approach. At this moment, a person jogged over from afar. Su Sanlang didn't recognize him, but the people beside him had already stood up with wild rabbits and pheasants in hand. They smiled and said, "Butler's son, look at my pheasants. I just caught them this morning. Their skins aren't even broken. Butler's son, look at my wild rabbit. It's very fat. Its fur is also very good." People surrounded Butler's son, carrying their prey and smiling. A person who introduced the wild fruits even stepped forward and handed Butler's son a peach. He said obsequiously, "Butler's son, try it. These wild peaches from the mountains are very sweet." Butler's son covered his nose and waved. He glanced around and said, "Move aside. If you dirty my clothes, you'll have to pay for it." The people stepped back in unison, but they still looked hopefully at Butler's son. Su Sanlang also came back to his senses. This was the butler of a big family coming out to buy goods. However, he could no longer squeeze in and could only stand there. Butler's son did not choose anyone's things. Instead, he walked forward. The people surrounding him had no choice but to make way. As soon as the people moved aside, Butler's son saw the hares Su Sanlang had placed on the ground. He didn't look impressed at all. His eyes narrowed as he walked forward and said, "I want all of these. Carry them and come with me." Joy surged in Su Sanlang's heart. He nervously stuttered as he tried to sell wild chestnuts to Butler's son. Butler's son, my wild chestnuts are also very fresh. They dried just right and are very sweet." With that, Su Sanlang pulled open the sack at the side so that Butler's son could see the chestnuts inside. Butler's son looked over and said, "It's not bad. They're rare. Bring it along. It's not bad to let young master try it." After buying Su Sanlang's goods, Butler's son didn't look at the others anymore. He turned around and left. Su Sanlang happily picked the basket up and followed. He didn't mind if people looked at him with envy. He naturally understood that his presence affected the opportunities of the others. However, this was just an interlude. After Butler's son left, others quickly came to buy the goods. Those who did not sell their prey did not care about being jealous of Su Sanlang. They immediately put on a smile and presented their prey to the buyers. Su Sanlang, on the other hand, followed Butler's son away from the noisy street to the back door of a large house. Looking at the good house with green bricks and tiles, Su Sanlang exclaimed inwardly. As he followed Butler's son through the back door, Butler's son said, "You look unfamiliar. This is your first time in town, right?" Su Sanlang nodded quickly. Yes, this is my first time here." Butler's son smiled and said, "I can tell. Don't worry, the Sun family won't make things difficult for you. Your goods are not bad. We'll pay you a good amount for them. We'll give you 25 copper coins per catty for the animals. These wild chestnuts are rare too, so we'll give you 18 copper coins." This price was very high. Su Sanlang nodded happily and was overjoyed. Okay, thank you, Butler's son." Su Sanlang thanked him profusely and followed Butler's son to the kitchen. Butler's son pointed to the ground and said casually, "Leave the things here." With that, Butler's son shouted towards the kitchen, "Fu, come out and take a look at the goods." A voice came from the kitchen. Soon, a slightly plump man walked out. He looked about 50 years old. When he came out, he went straight to the wild animals. He examined them and nodded in satisfaction. Not bad. Let's weigh them and calculate the money. Oh, there's also chestnuts." Coincidentally, the young master wants to eat sugar-fried chestnuts. Sun Fu reached into the sack of chestnuts and scooped up a handful. He was already planning on how to use them. Butler's son smiled and agreed. "That's right. That's what I thought as well." Su Sanlang stood silently at the side, waiting to calculate the payment. At the same time, he made a mental note of this place. He thought that if he had anything to sell in the future, he would come here and ask first. If the Sun residents didn't want it, he would sell it at the market. Sun Fu called the kitchen staff out and quickly weighed the goods. The 3 hares and 2 pheasants weighed a total of 20 catties. 25 copper coins per caddy amounted to 500 copper coins. The wild chestnuts weighed 17 caddies. 18 copper coins per caddy amounted to 306 copper coins. Together, they were worth 806 copper coins. Susan Lang was elated and shocked by the numbers. Butler's son saw his face and found it a little funny. He teased, "Why are you acting so silly? Haven't you seen money before?" Butler's son was teasing, but Susan Lang had really never seen money before. He nodded in embarrassment, his dim gaze hiding many stories that he could not tell anyone. Butler's son had sharp eyes and thought that this person had a story to tell. However, the two of them were not familiar with each other, so it was not good to ask about other people's family matters rashly. Therefore, he did not ask any more questions. Instead, he counted the money and gave it to Susan Lang. Then, he sent Susan Lang out the door. Susan Lang kept the money tightly against his chest. On the way, he could not help but touch his chest. Such caution made Butler's son sigh. When he sent Susan Lang out, Butler's son kindly reminded him, "Young man, you have to be more magnanimous when you go out. If you're being too obviously careful, others will know that you have valuables with you." Susan Lang immediately understood. He looked at Butler's son gratefully. "Butler's son, thank you." Butler's son smiled and waved his hand. "It's not a big deal. If you have good stuff in the future, just send them to our Sun residence." Susan Lang nodded gratefully. He was thinking about firewood, and since Butler's son was so easygoing, he asked, "Butler's son, does the Sun residence need firewood? I'm good at chopping firewood. I guarantee that it's all good firewood." After Susan Lang asked the question, he looked at Butler's son and waited for him to answer. Butler's son smiled and said, "We've no need for that. Seeing that you're a good person, I'll say a few more words. Wealthy families don't need to buy firewood. Only ordinary families might buy it, but the prices won't be very high. Moreover, most people have already agreed on a deal long ago. If you had come a month earlier, you might have had some business, but now, it's difficult." Susan Lang's heart sank, but he smiled and thanked Butler's son. "Thank you for telling me so much, Butler's son. The firewood business would not work." Butler's son's kind words had saved him a lot of detours. Butler's son waved his hand indifferently. "I see that your hunting skills are not bad. Why don't you work harder on this? The Sun residents will definitely not mistreat you if you send us good products." With that, Butler's son went back in. Susan Lang could not tell Butler's son that he was not a real hunter and that it was all luck. He could only smile and agree. After leaving the Sun residence, Susan Lang wanted to touch his chest several times, before he remembered Butler's son's reminder and lowered his raised hand. He would act as an ordinary person with no money. Thinking of the thin sheets at home, Susan Lang asked for directions to the cloth shop. An ordinary bolt of cotton cloth would cost 300 copper coins, a slightly inferior bolt of sackcloth would cost 200 copper coins. Cotton was calculated by caddies. A caddy of ordinary cotton cost 20 copper coins, and good cotton quality cost 30 copper coins a caddy. Susan Lang calculated the money in his hands and gritted his teeth. He bought a bolt of cotton cloth, a bolt of sackcloth, and 10 caddies of ordinary cotton. This cost him 700 coins at once, although his heart ached when he thought that his family would not suffer from the cold this winter. A smile appeared on his face again. In previous winters, their family's winter clothes were modified from the old clothes of his eldest brother and second brother. The cotton was thin and not warm. Every winter, Madame Zhao would always cough. This year, their family could wear new clothes and be warm through the winter. After packing everything in the basket on his back, Susan Lang went to the grocery store and bought some salt. Salt was very expensive. He only got half a caddy for 50 coins. He had 56 coins left. He didn't plan to use them. He looked at the sky. It was already evening. He had to go home. On the way out of the city, Susan Lang paid the entrance fee he owed. After the soldiers let him through, Susan Lang eagerly carried his basket and rushed home. 2 hours later, Susan Lang was back in the familiar village. It was barely 5 in the afternoon and most of the villagers were busy in the fields. He did not encounter many people on the way, but there were still people who saw Susan Lang carrying a full basket back. Susan Lang didn't care. He just wanted to get home. Even before he reached home, in the distance, he could see Susan Mei with her 2 older brothers, catching insects. He could hear their sons cheering happily, and Susan Lang's gaze was tinged with joy. Susan Mei was washing diapers when she saw Susan Lang return. She shouted happily, "Daddy is back." Su Chong and Su Hua also looked down the road and saw Susan Lang. They shouted happily, "Father, there's another egg." Susan Mei had already gotten up and ran to him. She looked up and said to him, "Father, there's another egg today." I picked it up and put it at home. Su Chong and Su Hua also ran over and surrounded Su Sanlang. Father, Hua, and I touched the egg, it's not broken. Su Hua licked the corner of his mouth and looked at Su Sanlang hopefully. Father, the egg smells so good. Su Sanlang was in a good mood. He smiled and patted the heads of the 3 children. You're all good children, I'll make egg soup for you tonight, yay. Su Chong and Su Hua clapped in unison. Su Sanmei swallowed, she wanted to eat eggs too. But when she thought of her mother and sister, she said sensibly, Father, I won't drink, let mother drink more so that Si Mei can eat her fill too. Su Sanmei liked Su Xiaolu very much. At the age of 6, she already knew that her newborn sister could not eat anything and could only rely on her mother's milk to survive. Only when Madame Zhao ate well, would she have enough milk to feed Si Mei. His sensible daughter always made Su Sanlang's heart ache. He reached out and stroked her hair. Give it to our little sister. Father, I don't want it anymore either. Su Chong looked at Su Sanlang in confusion. He was giving away, but he also looked like he could not bear to do so. I don't want it either, feed my sister well. Su Hua waved his hand as well, enduring the pain. Su Sanlang couldn't describe what he was feeling. He patted his sons on the head, then patted Su Sanmei on the head and praised them. Good children, you're all good children. Even his 2 mentally retarded sons knew how to be modest. They might never understand how precious this was. Leading the 3 children into the house, Su Sanlang went straight into the back room. Madame Zhao had already sat up when she heard Su Sanlang's voice. She had been waiting anxiously. When she saw Su Sanlang enter, the worry in her heart eased. She said gently, Sanlang, you've worked hard. Su Sanlang put down his basket and said happily, Darling, I bought cotton and cloth. We don't have to suffer from the cold in winter. When Madame Zhao heard this, joy surged in her heart. She said in a sobbing voice, Really? Su Sanlang took the cloth and cotton out of the basket on his back and put it on the bed as if he were presenting treasures. Madame Zhao was so happy that she cried. Her hands trembled as she touched the cloth and cotton cautiously. Darling, don't cry, it'll hurt your eyes. Seeing Madame Zhao cry made Su Sanlang's heart ache. Su Sanmei also went to Madame Zhao's side to wipe her tears. Mother, don't cry. Madame Zhao nodded. She was so happy. Ever since they were chased out, she had been worried about how they would spend the winter. Although they had also been cold in the past, they did not die from the cold. Now she could finally stop worrying. Su Sanlang also began to talk about what had happened after he entered town. Madame Zhao listened quietly and smiled gently. Su Sanlang concluded, The heavens are still looking after our family after all. Madame Zhao nodded in agreement. Su Xiaolu, who did not have much presence, made a cute sound at the right time. She had been awake since she heard Su Sanlang's voice. In fact, she also worried about how much he could sell the goods for. After hearing Su Sanlang's report to Madame Zhao, she was relieved. Wild animals were still valuable. Without this threat hanging over this house, there was no need to worry about freezing to death this winter. With the diligent Sanmei around, there might not even be a lack of meat to eat this winter. Si Mei is awake. Madame Zhao looked at Su Xiaolu gently and picked her up after some thought. Su Sanlang leaned over to take a look. He reached out and said, Darling, let me hold Si Mei. He had not held his youngest daughter since she was born. He had been so busy and anxious these past few days that he did not even have the time to hug his daughter properly. Madame Zhao nodded and carefully handed Su Xiaolu to Su Sanlang. Su Xiaolu was quickly carried carefully by Su Sanlang. Su Xiaolu looked at him and opened her mouth. Ya, Su Sanlang's eyes were gentle as he looked at his little daughter lovingly. He said softly, Si Mei is so cute. Father, Si Mei is so obedient at home. She smiles when she sees us and doesn't cry at all. Su Sanmei moved her head closer. Su Xiaolu's eyes turned to look at her and she smiled. Su Chong and Su Hua were also watching from the side. They wanted to poke Su Xiaolu's face, but they seemed to be afraid that they would hurt Su Xiaolu. Seeing this, Su Sanlang smiled and said, Don't be afraid, just curl your fingers and gently touch Si Mei's little face. Like this, Su Sanlang carefully freed his right hand to demonstrate to his 2 sons. Su Chong and Su Hua mimicked it seriously and then carefully touched Su Xiaolu's face. Su Xiaolu moved her head and pressed her face against her brother's hands, scaring Su Chong and Su Hua away. Su Xiaolu blinked innocently. She didn't mean to scare them. Su Sanlang and Madame Zhao both smiled. Su Sanmei gently pressed against Su Xiaolu's cheek and whispered, Si Mei, I'm your 3rd sister. Su Sanmei often helped change diapers, so she was not afraid. Su Xiaolu also liked her diligent 3rd sister very much. She moved her head and touched her warm little hand. At that moment, Su Sanlang felt happier than ever. Madame Zhao touched the cloth and said, Sanlang, I'll tailor your clothes for you later. My body has already recovered. This small chore isn't tiring. Su Sanlang looked at Madame Zhao and felt that the warmth in her eyes was as warm as the spring breeze in March. After a few days of rest, Madame Zhao's complexion was not as withered as before. Su Sanlang nodded slightly. Okay, but you can't tire yourself out. I'm not in a hurry to wear it. It's not cold yet. Madame Zhao smiled happily. She reached out to stroke Su Chong, Su Hua, and Su Sanmei's hair and said, "After I make new clothes for your father, I'll make them for you." Su Chong and Su Hua were overjoyed to have new clothes to wear. However, Su Sanmei hesitated for a moment before lowering her eyes and gritting her teeth. "Mother, I don't have to wear new clothes. Let's make new clothes for Simei." The winter was so cold that she feared her newborn sister would not survive it. Su Sanmei's overly mature behavior made Madame Zhao's nose sting. Su Sanlang's heart ached as well. He stroked Su Sanmei's hair with his broad palm and said, "Sanmei, be good. Father bought enough cloth to make new clothes for all of us. You can have them, and so can Simei." Su Sanmei smiled upon hearing this. "Thank you, father and mother." Su Sanmei seemed to remember something and suddenly said, "By the way, eldest brother, second brother, and I caught a lot of insects today. The chickens couldn't finish them. I wrapped them all up. I'll bring them to you." Su Sanmei ran out. Su Chong and Su Hua looked up at Su Sanlang with their chests puffed out. Su Chong said, "Father, I caught 3 more than Hua." Sanmei said that I'm awesome. As Su Chong spoke, he reached out and patted Su Hua's head like an adult. But the insects that Hua caught were fatter than mine. Su Hua pursed his lips and nodded in agreement. "Brother is awesome. So am I." We listened to Sanmei. Su Sanlang was touched. He looked at his 2 sons lovingly and nodded with a smile. "You're both great. You're both good children of ours." Su Sanmei quickly brought the leaf-wrapped insect into the house. Su Sanlang placed Su Xiaolu on the bed and took it from Su Sanmei's hands. It was heavy, he said. "Sanmei, I will cook the rice. You stay at home and watch the fire. I'll take your eldest and second brothers out to set up the traps again. With such good bait, there's a higher chance of catching prey." Su Sanmei nodded. "Okay, Daddy, be careful." Su Sanlang looked at Madame Zhao and said, "Darling, it's not dark yet and setting up those traps won't take much time." Madame Zhao nodded slightly and said, "Sanlang, be careful on the way." After saying that, Madame Zhao instructed her 2 sons, Hua and Chong, "You have to listen to Daddy, understand?" Su Chong and Su Hua nodded. "They'll do as they're told." Su Sanlang went out with Su Chong and Su Hua after washing the rice and starting the fire. Su Sanmei watched over the fire obediently. Madame Zhao patted Su Xiaolu and said softly after feeding her, "Simei, sleep well, I'll clean up the cotton." Su Xiaolu pouted, blinked, and obediently went to sleep. Over the past few days, Madame Zhao had been in a much better state than before. Their family was not doing well. If she did nothing, she would be anxious. She could just sit on the bed and make some clothes. It would not be too tiring to move her hands. She would also keep an eye on her and let Madame Zhao rest every once in a while. She also sank her consciousness into the space to absorb spiritual energy. Seeing that Su Xiaolu was obedient, Madame Zhao heaved a sigh of relief. She could not help but laugh at herself for speaking foolishly to her younger daughter. Madame Zhao did not have the time to think too much. She started to prepare the cotton. Ordinary cotton was not carefully selected. There would also be some leaves and other things inside. She picked those out and threw them away so that the finished clothes would be comfortable to wear. After she worked for a while, Su Xiaolu would make some noise and Madame Zhao would have to rest for a while. If she didn't rest, Su Xiaolu would cry. Helpless, Madame Zhao could only rest after every hour. Looking at Su Xiaolu's obedient appearance, she couldn't help but mutter, "Simei, are you feeling sorry for me? For some reason, I feel that you're very sensible. Even though you're just a baby, how can you understand? Perhaps you're just not used to me not holding you." Su Xiaolu obediently leaned against Madame Zhao without crying or making a fuss. Madame Zhao smiled again and said, "But I believe that you feel sorry for me and want me to rest." Su Xiaolu opened her eyes and looked at Madame Zhao. Madame Zhao looked at Su Xiaolu's bright eyes, and could not help but kiss her cheek. Simei's eyes are so beautiful. If Su Xiaolu could speak, she would also tell Madame Zhao that her eyes were really gentle. Everyone in the family made her feel warm. Madame Zhao rested for a while before continuing to clean up the cotton. After Su Sanmei finished cooking, she put off the fire and came to help clean up. When it was completely dark and all the cotton had been cleaned up, Madame Zhao said worriedly, "Why aren't they back yet?" Just then, a noise came from outside. "Darling, I'm back." Hearing Su Sanlang's voice, Madame Zhao was relieved. She smiled and said to Su Sanmei, "Sanmei, go get water for your father to wash his hands and eat." sure thing. Su Sanmei got out of bed and went out. It was really too late today, Su Sanlang said apologetically to the three children. Can I cook that egg for you all tomorrow? Su Chong and Su Hua were craving eggs, but they still remembered what they said not long ago. They shook their heads and said, no, it's for little sister. Su Sanmei also said, Father, we won't eat it. When the hen lays an egg again tomorrow, we'll cook poached eggs for mother. Su Sanlang smiled and nodded. Okay. Su Sanmei did not know that chickens did not lay eggs every day. Su Sanlang looked into her glittering eyes and could not bear to tell her this. Su Sanlang first brought food to Madame Zhao before coming out to eat. Su Sanmei was sitting on a small stool with her two brothers and eating slowly. When she saw Su Sanlang come out, Su Sanmei said, Father, should I continue catching insects with my big brother and second brother tomorrow? Su Sanlang thought for a moment and shook his head. Tomorrow, Chong and Hua will be turning the soil with father. They won't be able to catch insects with you. You can still catch them. The firewood business was out of the question, and the traps might not yield anything. The most important thing in the house was the land. The 4 acres of land here had been abandoned for a long time and it was thin and dry. He would have to turn the soil and sprinkle some vegetable seeds to nourish the land over the winter. Although the 2 sons were mentally disabled, they were still half-grown and considered half a labor. Since Madame Zhao needed someone by her side, it was just right for Su Sanmei to stay and take care of Madame Zhao and the child. Su Sanmei smiled and nodded. Okay, I'll catch a lot for our chickens. Su Sanlang smiled warmly. Not long after dinner, the family washed up and went to bed. The next morning, Su Sanlang got up first to turn the soil. Madame Zhao also got up. She had taken Su Sanlang's measurements last night and could start to cut the cloth. There were no scissors at home, so she asked Su Sanlang to give her the scythe in advance. Su Sanmei was sleeping soundly next to Su Xiaolu. The 2 sons were also fast asleep on the other bed. Madame Zhao worked quietly, but she was fast and focused. Su Xiaolu only sighed and did not disturb Madame Zhao. She knew that if the family's situation was better, Madame Zhao would not be so anxious. The weather was gradually getting colder, and there was not much at home. If Madame Zhao were to lie down for a month or 2, her heart would burn with anxiety. Since everyone was trying their best, she could not stay idle. Su Xiaolu tried her best to struggle her hand out. Since she could not feed Madame Zhao, she would give her diligent and cute sister some spiritual spring water. Without enough food and clothes, Su Sanmei was also thin and small. Her hair was yellow and messy. Su Xiaolu put her hand into Su Sanmei's mouth and the spiritual spring water moistened her mouth. In her sleep, Su Sanmei knew nothing. She subconsciously swallowed the sweetness in her mouth. After feeding her for a while, Su Xiaolu retracted her hand. Her third sister doted on her so much. If she woke up and found herself sucking on her sister's fingers, she would probably be frightened. After doing all this, Su Xiaolu sank her consciousness into the space to recuperate. When it was about time, she came out and cried to make Madame Zhao rest. Hearing her cries, Su Sanmei woke up and quickly patted Su Xiaolu. Don't cry, Simei. When Madame Zhao saw that Su Sanmei was awake, she said, Sanmei, coax Simei, I'll be done soon. Su Xiaolu pursed her lips and let out an aggrieved and loud cry. Wah, wah. Su Sanmei was shocked and at a loss. Su Chong and Su Hua were both woken up by the crying. Even Su Sanlang, who was behind the house, was alarmed. He looked up at the sky and thought it was time to make breakfast. Su Sanlang put down his hoe and returned. Before he entered the house, he asked, What's wrong with Simei? Why is she crying so loudly? Madame Zhao quickly put down the cloth in her hand and went over to hold Su Xiaolu. As she coaxed her, she replied to Su Sanlang, Sanlang, I don't know either. Maybe she woke up and didn't see me. All right, mother is here. Simei, be good and stop crying. Madame Zhao coaxed her patiently and even wanted to feed Su Xiaolu. However, Su Xiaolu refused and cried until her face turned red. Madame Zhao did not know what to do either.